The house didn't scream. That's what haunts investigators the most. A $13.5 million Brentwood estate. Gated, guarded by reputation, wealth, and silence. 2 elderly bodies inside. Stabbed. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. And yet, no neighbors calling 911 over screams. No alarms tripped. No frantic rush into the street. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just quiet. So let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. How do 2 people die violently inside one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Los Angeles, without anyone hearing a thing? That question sits at the center of everything you're about to hear. Because this case is not just about a crime. It's about what people said when they didn't think it mattered. What they revealed without realizing they were revealing anything at all. And how a few overlooked words may have changed the entire direction of a murder investigation. 2 lives ended on Sunday, December 14th. Reiner, 78. Michelle, 70. Married. Wealthy. Long established in their community. Found stabbed to death inside their Brentwood home. The official cause, multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death, homicide. The date of death, Sunday, December 14th. That much, at least, is not disputed. But everything else fractures the moment you look closer. Because within hours of the discovery, police arrested their 32-year-old son, Nick Reiner. He lived on the property, not inside the main house, but in the guest house. Close enough to hear something. Close enough to see something. Close enough to become the immediate focal point of an investigation that moved with startling speed. He was arrested that same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And just when the public thought the story had settled into a familiar, tragic pattern, another name entered the frame. Tracy Reiner, adopted daughter of the late Rob Reiner. A family connection that immediately ignited media interest. According to reports, Tracy was later arrested as well, accused of acting in coordination with Nick Reiner in what prosecutors describe as a joint act of violence. 2 suspects. 1 family. 2 dead parents. Simple, right? Except nothing about this case behaves like a simple story. Because from the very beginning, there were moments that didn't quite fit. Statements that landed oddly. Details that seemed insignificant at first, but grew heavier with time. And one phrase, short, casual, almost throwaway, that investigators reportedly could not ignore once they heard it. A phrase that, depending on how you hear it, changes everything. But before we get there, we need to slow down. Because stories like this don't unravel all at once. They unravel in layers. And the first layer begins not with an arrest, but with a discovery. The bodies were reportedly found by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, age 27. Imagine that moment. You arrive at your parents' home. You expect normalcy, familiar smells, familiar silence. Maybe the television on too loud. Maybe unanswered calls that annoy you before they worry you. Instead, you find something that can never be unseen. Police reports indicate that Romy contacted authorities and, during that initial interaction, made a statement that would quietly redirect the entire investigation. She allegedly told police there was a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. Think about that. Not an intruder, not a stranger, not someone who broke in from the outside. A family member. That single detail matters more than most people realize, because first impressions in homicide investigations are powerful. They shape where detectives look, who they question first, how they interpret evidence that, in another context, might seem neutral. And from that moment on, the focus turned inward, toward the family, toward Nick, and eventually, toward Tracy. But here's where the story starts to slip out of its expected shape. Because if this were just a case of proximity and opportunity, if this were simply about who lived closest or who had access, the narrative would already be finished. Arrest made, charges filed, case closed in the public imagination. Yet investigators didn't stop asking questions. They kept replaying statements. They kept revisiting timelines. They kept circling back to moments that, on the surface, seemed unimportant. And that's where the idea of accidental revelation comes in. You see, not all confessions happen in interrogation rooms. Some happen in interviews. Some happen in casual conversation. Some happen when people think they're speaking emotionally, not legally. History is full of cases where suspects didn't realize the weight of their own words until it was far too late. a pronoun used incorrectly, a detail volunteered too early, a phrase that implies knowledge no one should have. In this case, investigators reportedly zeroed in on language. Not shouted declarations, not dramatic breakdowns. Language. One short phrase. For words, according to some accounts. Spoken without emphasis, without correction, without immediate denial. And once that phrase was logged, replayed, and analyzed, it reportedly refused to let go. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before any phrase becomes evidence, before any theory hardens into a charge, there is always the same uncomfortable question. Why? Why would this happen inside a family like this? From the outside, the Reiners had everything that signals stability, wealth, property, legacy, access, the kind of insulation most people believe protects against chaos. But families don't implode because they lack money. They implode because of pressure. Pressure that builds quietly. Pressure that isn't visible to neighbors. Pressure that doesn't show up in Instagram photos or holiday cards. And when pressure finally releases, it rarely does so neatly. What we know is this. Nick Reiner lived on the property, in the guest house. That alone doesn't make him guilty. Proximity is not proof. But in homicide investigations, proximity always matters. Especially when the estimated time of death overlaps with when someone is known to be nearby. Tracy Reiner, according to reports, became part of the investigative focus later. The timing of her involvement, the nature of her alleged coordination with Nick, and the specific actions attributed to her remain subjects of intense scrutiny and, in some cases, sealed filings. And then there's the timeline. The date of death, Sunday, December 14th, was not immediately clear to the public. There was speculation, conflicting reports, confusion over when exactly the fatal injuries were inflicted. That uncertainty alone complicates everything, because timelines are the skeleton keys of criminal cases. Get the timeline wrong, and nothing else fits. Get it right, and even lies start telling the truth. Investigators reportedly had to reconcile physical evidence, digital footprints, and statements that did not always align perfectly. Phones, movements, gaps where there should have been activity, activity where there should have been none. And woven through all of it was a strange, unsettling calm. No signs of forced entry publicly emphasized early on. No chaotic crime scene leaks suggesting a frenzied outsider. No immediate explanation that made everyone nod and move on. Instead, there was hesitation. And hesitation in law enforcement usually means one thing. Something doesn't add up. Now, let's talk about the media for a moment. Because as soon as arrests are made, narratives harden. Headlines simplify. Complexity gets sanded down until it fits into a familiar shape. A villain, a motive, an ending. But real investigations don't move in straight lines. They loop. They double back. They pause. And sometimes, they hinge on moments the public never notices. In this case, what didn't initially dominate the headlines was what investigators reportedly flagged internally: consistency. Or rather, the lack of it. Consistency in timelines. Consistency in phrasing. Consistency in emotional reactions. None of these things prove guilt. But together, they create friction. And friction generates heat. The kind of heat that makes detectives listen more closely the second time. And the third. So here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. What if the most important evidence in this case wasn't physical at all? What if it wasn't a weapon, or bloodstain, or fingerprint? What if it was something said casually, emotionally, maybe even unintentionally? That revealed more than it should have. Because that's where this story is headed. Not toward a single explosive revelation, but toward a slow realization that some details only make sense when placed next to each other. That words spoken without care can become the loudest thing in a silent house. In the hours after the arrests, investigators continued their work. Quietly, methodically, not rushing to explain everything to the public. And somewhere in that process, a phrase was replayed. Then replayed again, and each time, it landed a little heavier. For words, allegedly. For words that didn't sound like a confession at first. For words that could be dismissed as grief. For words that, under scrutiny, suggested something else entirely. But we're not there yet. Because before those words could matter, investigators had to understand the night itself. Who was awake? Who was moving? Who knew what and when? And that brings us back to the house. the one that didn't scream. Because houses don't just hold memories. They hold timelines. They remember footsteps, doors, light switches, patterns. And when detectives began to truly listen to what that house was saying, the story started to bend in ways no one expected. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The house stood in silence that Sunday evening, but inside, everything had already changed. Two lives that had spanned decades ended violently, and yet the world outside remained oblivious. Brentwood is a neighborhood built on privacy, prestige, and perfection. People expect the quiet. They expect beauty. They do not expect murder. Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were the picture of stability. Wealthy, well-connected, and deeply entrenched in their community, they had built a life that many envied. Their home was immaculate. Expensive, yes, but not just in the monetary sense. Every room spoke of careful curation. Every detail whispered of intention. This was a house that should have protected its inhabitants, not witnessed their deaths. But wealth does not shield you from family dysfunction, not from pressure, not from secrets, and, most importantly, not from the consequences of decisions made behind closed doors. The first call to 911 came in the early evening. According to reports, it was Romy, the Reiner's 27-year-old daughter, who discovered her parents' bodies. Imagine that moment. The expectation of dinner with family or a casual Sunday check-in, replaced by horror. Two people who raised you, nurtured you, and shaped your world found brutally slain. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. A date assigned by investigators, December 14th. Romy reportedly made a statement that immediately shifted the trajectory of the investigation. She suggested that a family member could be involved. It was a casual observation, perhaps rooted in fear, perhaps in grief. But it immediately drew police attention inward. The focus was no longer on strangers, intruders, or random violence. It was on those closest to the victims. Nick Reiner, 32, living in the guest house on the same property, became the primary subject. His proximity alone placed him under scrutiny, but proximity does not equal guilt. Yet in murder investigations, time, location, and opportunity are crucial. Police reportedly acted quickly, and Nick was arrested the same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Then came Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter of the late Rob Reiner. Media outlets scrambled to cover her connection, framing it as shocking, perhaps unbelievable. Reports indicate she was later arrested, allegedly acting in conjunction with Nick. The narrative had shifted from tragedy to potential conspiracy, and from family grief to public intrigue. But arrests and charges are only the beginning. Investigators needed more than assumptions. They needed details. And those details often appear in the most unlikely places. A phrase muttered in passing, a look caught on video, or a timeline that doesn't align. And that's exactly what happened here. Investigators reportedly identified a phrase, casual, almost throwaway, that seemed unremarkable at first. A phrase that, in isolation, might have been ignored. But context matters. And in this context, the phrase suggested awareness, knowledge, perhaps even involvement. Before we dive deeper into that, it's important to consider the broader timeline. Sunday, December 14th, was not just the date of death. It was the day that set off a cascade of events. Calls, movements, observations, and gaps in information all became critical. Investigators meticulously reconstructed the timeline, analyzing every possible source of evidence. From phone records to security cameras, from eyewitness accounts to inconsistencies in statements. The layout of the house itself played a significant role. The main house, where the victims were found, was separate from the guest house where Nick lived. This separation theoretically provides an alibi, or at least the appearance of one. But investigators reportedly noted patterns and footprints that suggested otherwise. Doors opened at unusual times, lights flickered in ways inconsistent with routine, and audio records captured sounds that did not match anyone's account. It is here that the concept of accidental revelation becomes critical. Not every confession happens under formal questioning. Some slip out in casual conversation, when a person believes they are speaking emotionally rather than legally. Words can carry weight far beyond intent, and in this case, investigators reportedly seized on such a moment. The media narrative only partially captured these subtleties. Headlines simplify. They demand a villain, a motive, a clear sequence. But real investigations are rarely linear. They are layered, iterative, and often hinge on minute details. The statements that Nick and Tracy made, the moments captured in interviews, and the inadvertent slips in language all became pieces of a complex puzzle. Consider this. A single pronoun can change the meaning of a statement. A shift from I to we can imply coordination or shared responsibility. Investigators are trained to notice such shifts, to replay them, to interrogate their significance. And in this case, according to reports, the phrase in question was replayed repeatedly, each time raising more questions. Beyond statements, the psychological environment of the house matters. Families, even wealthy ones, are not immune to tension. Internal pressure, unresolved disputes, and emotional instability can accumulate silently. What seems insignificant on the surface can become the catalyst for tragedy. From the moment Romy discovered her parents, investigators had to reconstruct not just physical movements, but emotional ones. Who felt threatened? Who was under pressure? Who acted impulsively? And who was calculating? The answers would not be immediate, and in many ways, they remain incomplete. The contrast between perception and reality is striking. From the outside, the Reiners' life appeared perfect, wealthy, connected, poised. Inside, there were fractures, hidden conflicts, and questions that only investigators could see emerging in hindsight. Yet, despite the arrests and the initial media frenzy, the story was far from complete. Investigators reportedly continued to identify discrepancies in timelines and statements. Each inconsistency, no matter how small, became a thread to follow. And when multiple threads intersect, they often reveal patterns invisible at first glance. That night, the night everything ended, was more than a singular event. It was a confluence of timing, opportunity, proximity, and, crucially, language. The physical evidence set the stage, but the verbal evidence became the lens through which the case would be viewed. Think about it. How many times do we underestimate the significance of words spoken casually, emotionally, or absent-mindedly? How many times do we fail to notice patterns in family dynamics until it is too late? And how many times can silence speak louder than any confession? In this investigation, silence did not remain silent for long. Investigators listened, replayed, analyzed, questioned. The house may not have screamed, but investigators treated it as if it did. Every creak, every footstep, every echo mattered. And in that silence, one phrase reportedly stood out. Not shouted, not dramatic, not legally framed, just said. And once it was caught, everything began to shift. But before the implications of that phrase could be fully understood, the timeline, the movements, and the dynamics of the household needed to be examined in painstaking detail. The investigation would not be quick. It would not be neat. It would be methodical, meticulous, and relentless. Because in cases like this, the smallest detail can alter the trajectory of an entire investigation. And when the detail is a phrase spoken accidentally, without thought, the impact can be extraordinary. By the end of the next chapter, you will see why investigators considered what was said that night more consequential than what they initially saw. Why the timeline alone could not explain the events. And why, in a family like the Reiners, what appears simple is never simple. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The call to police came not from a neighbor, not from a passerby, but from inside the house. Romy Reiner, 27, the daughter of Reiner and Michelle, discovered her parents' bodies. Picture that moment, a Sunday that begins like any other, filled with routine and expectation, abruptly replaced by horror. The kind of horror that imprints itself on memory so completely, it refuses to fade. Romy reportedly made a statement during that initial call to authorities that immediately shifted the investigation. She didn't speculate about an intruder. She didn't accuse a stranger. She suggested that a dangerous family member could be involved. That single line, casual in delivery but heavy in implication, reportedly became the thread police would follow to unravel the complex narrative of what happened that night. Think about that. A family member, not an outsider. The suggestion that someone close to the victims could be capable of murder reshapes everything. In homicide investigations, proximity is crucial. Opportunity is everything. And in many cases, family members are the first to be scrutinized, not because of prejudice, but because history repeatedly shows that familial homicides are rarely random. Investigators arrived at the Brentwood estate within minutes, police reports suggest. The crime scene was immediately secured, the bodies examined, and preliminary assessments made. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. That much was clear. But why did no one hear anything? No neighbor reported screams. No security alerts were triggered. No calls to 911 before Romy's discovery. And then there was the human element. Family dynamics, emotional responses, and patterns of behavior all came under scrutiny. Investigators reportedly analyzed video footage, interview footage, and prior interactions for signs of tension, stress, or unusual behavior. Subtle cues, hesitation, tone of voice, word choice, were documented, compared, and analyzed. One of the critical elements investigators focused on was consistency. Inconsistencies in statements, both verbal and behavioral, became significant. For instance, conflicting accounts of who was where, at what time, and why created friction in the timeline that needed explanation. Even something as simple as the use of the word we versus I reportedly became a point of interest. Plural pronouns can suggest shared action or complicity, and in this case, reportedly flagged investigators' attention. But no single piece of evidence existed in isolation. The beauty and the horror of this investigation lies in how these threads intertwined. Timeline discrepancies, casual phrases, behavioral cues, family knowledge, proximity. Each alone might have been trivial. Together, they formed a pattern that demanded scrutiny. Romy's initial discovery was pivotal because it framed the investigation from the start. The suggestion of a dangerous family member shifted the lens inward, forcing investigators to consider that what appears familiar can also be threatening. Family members, after all, have the access, knowledge, and opportunity that strangers often lack. And in the moments following discovery, investigators reportedly realized that the statements they collected from Romy and others might hold keys to understanding not just what happened, but why. The night of December 14th set off a chain of events that would dominate public attention and legal proceedings for months. Every movement, every decision, every word would be scrutinized. And the discovery, Romy finding her parents, making that seemingly offhand comment, changed everything. By the end of that night, the investigation had multiple focal points. The physical evidence, the timeline of deaths, the proximity and behaviors of Nick and Tracy, and the statements that hinted at knowledge no outsider could have. Each element was a piece of a complex puzzle that refused to fit neatly into a narrative. But even as investigators worked, something lingered, a phrase, an accidental revelation that refused to stay silent. A slip of language that would demand attention, analysis, and interpretation. And while it might have seemed insignificant at first, that phrase, combined with Romy's initial statement, would eventually shape the trajectory of the case. Because sometimes, the most damning evidence isn't in the knife, the blood, or the crime scene. Sometimes, it's in what people say when they think no one is listening. But what came next would deepen the mystery even further, and the story would take a turn no one expected. Nick Reiner was 28 years younger than his father, living in the guest house of the very estate where his parents were found dead. At 32, he had his own life, his own routines, yet his proximity to the tragedy made him the central figure almost immediately. In homicide investigations, proximity is rarely ignored. And in this case, living just a few steps away from the main house placed Nick under scrutiny from the moment the bodies were discovered. But proximity alone doesn't establish guilt. Being close to a crime scene simply provides opportunity, not motive or intent. Still, the public narrative is rarely nuanced. Headlines and social media speculation often simplify complex realities into suspect equals culprit. And Nick Reiner found himself at the center of a whirlwind that no amount of explanation could immediately calm. Investigators began to map every movement, every interaction, every action that Nick could have taken in the hours leading up to the discovery of his parents' bodies. Even minor discrepancies in timelines became magnified. Calls unanswered, doors opened, lights flicked on and off. Every small detail was scrutinized. The smallest deviation from routine can become evidence when two lives are lost violently in the same household. But the story of Nick Reiner isn't just about opportunity. It's about pressure, the subtle, accumulated strain of family dynamics that can exist behind closed doors, even in households that appear perfect from the outside. Wealth and privilege can mask stress, resentment, and tension, creating an environment where emotions simmer beneath a polished surface. Investigators reportedly considered the relationships within the family. The interactions between Nick and his parents, Nick and his siblings, and even his connection to Tracy Reiner, who would later become central to the case. And here's where perception complicates everything. To the public, Nick was the son living nearby. To investigators, he was a complex variable in a web of timelines, statements, and behaviors. And to himself, he may have been grappling with a mixture of grief, confusion, and fear. The intersection of perception. How he saw himself, how the family saw him, and how the law would see him, added layers of complexity to the investigation. Investigators reportedly examined digital footprints in detail. Phone records, text messages, and online activity were cross-referenced against the timeline of events. Even small gaps in communication became important. Did Nick leave the guest house at a certain time? Was he reachable? Did he interact with his parents shortly before the estimated time of death? Each question mattered. Each answer created new threads to investigate. Behavioral analysis also played a critical role. Law enforcement officers noted stress indicators in interviews and recorded statements. Microexpressions, hesitations, and phrasing became points of interest. Investigators were not just listening to words. They were listening to what the words implied, to the pauses between words, and to the consistency of responses over time. In cases like this, behavior can reveal as much as physical evidence. But beyond observation, investigators reportedly looked for patterns in family interactions. How did Nick behave around his parents? How did he respond to conflict or stress? Were there signs of resentment, frustration, or unresolved tension that could provide context for the events of December 14th? Psychological profiling in family homicides is delicate, but it provides insight into the dynamics that might have influenced actions on the day in question. At the same time, media narratives often simplified these complexities. Headlines focused on proximity, arrest, and the shocking notion of family involvement. But the real work of the investigation involved piecing together fragments. Movements, interactions, and statements that, when examined together, could reveal a more complete picture. And it was in this granular examination that the so-called accidental revelation would eventually gain significance. Investigators also reportedly noted minor behavioral patterns that raised questions. Small inconsistencies in Nick's account of the evening, unexplained absences, and reactions to questioning all became part of a broader mosaic. While none of these elements individually proved guilt, together they created a friction that required explanation. In homicide cases, investigators rarely rely on a single piece of evidence. The strength of the case lies in the convergence of multiple factors. And that convergence became even more critical when Tracy Reiner entered the narrative. Investigators reportedly began to examine interactions between Nick and Tracy, looking for patterns of communication, coordination, or influence. In cases where two suspects are allegedly involved, understanding the relationship dynamics is as important as examining the physical evidence. Another layer of complexity involved the timeline of the night. Investigators needed to reconcile movements, statements, and digital footprints with the estimated time of death. Even minor deviations mattered. A single misaligned call or unexplained absence could shift suspicion or highlight new avenues of inquiry. In the context of the investigation, every detail carried weight. But what made Nick Reiner a central figure wasn't just proximity or opportunity. It was how investigators reportedly interpreted a combination of factors: timing, behavior, statements, and subtle language cues. Each factor alone might have been dismissed, but together, they created a pattern that could not be ignored. Think about that for a moment. A person's actions, words, and even pauses can converge in ways that create a narrative of potential culpability, even before the public sees any evidence. And that is what makes cases like this both chilling and compelling. Investigators reportedly continued to analyze recorded interviews and statements from Nick, not just for content, but for what was left unsaid. Silence, hesitation, and phrasing were all considered potential indicators of involvement. These subtle cues, when combined with other evidence, reportedly strengthened the focus on Nick as the investigation progressed. By the end of the day, the picture of Nick Reiner was no longer simply son living on the property. He became a variable in a complex, multi-layered investigation. Every action, every movement, every word was relevant. And as investigators dug deeper, they reportedly found that the most significant elements weren't always in what he did. They were in what he inadvertently revealed. Proximity, pressure, and perception, the triad that defines Nick's role in the investigation. Living close provided opportunity. Family dynamics created pressure. Public and private perception shaped interpretation. And when those elements intersected with accidental revelations and timeline discrepancies, investigators found themselves facing a narrative far more intricate than the media had suggested. The night of December 14th did not just end with tragedy. It ended with questions that would ripple through every subsequent stage of the investigation. Questions about motive, coordination, and communication. Questions that would later highlight the importance of a single, seemingly innocuous phrase, one that investigators reportedly replayed over and over, analyzing its implications for hours, then days, then weeks. Nick Reiner's proximity was not evidence in itself. But in the context of family dynamics, timeline inconsistencies, and behavioral observations, it became a critical lens through which investigators examined the events of that fateful night. And as the investigation deepened, one thing became increasingly clear. In cases like this, opportunity alone is not the story. Words, movements, and relationships, the subtleties of human behavior, often tell the tale more accurately than any headline could. But just when investigators thought they had begun to map the contours of the night, another factor emerged, one that would expand the scope of the case and shift focus beyond Nick alone. And what came next would reveal connections and implications no one anticipated, and set the stage for a revelation that would change everything. Just when the investigation seemed to be narrowing around Nick Reiner, another name emerged, and with it, a new set of questions. Tracy Reiner. Adopted daughter of the late Rob Reiner, Tracy's connection to Hollywood royalty immediately drew public attention. But for investigators, her relevance was not fame. It was proximity, opportunity, and potential involvement. Tracy Reiner reportedly became a focal point as authorities revisited the timeline and cross-referenced interactions. Investigators were interested in her movements on the day of December 14th, her access to the main house, and any patterns of communication with Nick in the days leading up to the deaths. It wasn't her public persona that mattered. It was what she knew, what she did, and what she said or didn't say. What made Tracy's potential involvement particularly significant was the concept of coordination. In cases where multiple suspects are allegedly involved, investigators must determine whether actions were independent or synchronized. In this case, reports suggest that authorities began to consider whether Tracy and Nick acted in concert. Did they plan? Did they communicate in ways that indicated shared intent? Or were they simply reacting to circumstances independently? Every text, call, or interaction was examined with precision. Investigators reportedly also considered psychological factors. Family dynamics in wealthy, high-profile households can be complex. Pressure, expectations, inheritance, and legacy can exacerbate tensions. While wealth itself is not a cause of violence, investigators often look at how stress manifests within family structures. Were there unresolved conflicts between Tracy and her adoptive family? Between her and Nick? Understanding these dynamics can provide context, although context alone cannot establish guilt. Media coverage at the time sensationalized Tracy's involvement, framing it as a shocking twist in an already tragic story. But the investigation was grounded in methodical examination. Investigators reportedly focused on inconsistencies in statements, unusual patterns of behavior, and interactions that did not align with initial timelines. Every small discrepancy was scrutinized, from minor hesitations in responses to slight shifts in phrasing during interviews. It was during this stage of the investigation that the alleged accidental revelation reportedly gained significance. Investigators reportedly noted that certain language, phrases spoken casually or in passing, implied knowledge that neither Nick nor Tracy should have had without direct involvement. The phrasing was subtle, almost conversational, but its implications were profound. For words, according to reports, became a key point of analysis. And those words, when combined with timeline inconsistencies and behavioral cues, reportedly influenced how investigators approached Tracy's potential role. The timeline itself became more intricate as Tracy entered the picture. Where was she during critical windows of time? What did digital evidence reveal about her movements? Were there communications that could link her to actions taken inside the main house? Investigators reportedly reconstructed the sequence of events down to the minute, using digital footprints, witness statements, and security data. Each detail was relevant because, in a case of this nature, even minor deviations can suggest coordination or prior knowledge. Investigators also reportedly focused on interactions between Nick and Tracy leading up to the deaths. Were there patterns of messaging or behavior that suggested planning? Did one influence the other's actions? And importantly, were there inconsistencies between what they individually reported and what evidence indicated? These questions became central to understanding whether their actions were independent or collaborative. Behavioral analysis continued to be a tool in assessing Tracy's involvement. Investigators examined recorded interviews for subtle indicators. Microexpressions, tone, pauses, and choice of words. These cues, when aligned with other evidence, can suggest awareness, involvement, or intent. In cases of family homicide, investigators often rely on these subtle observations to identify potential discrepancies between stated knowledge and actual events. The public narrative, however, was far simpler. Headlines emphasized familial betrayal and shocking Hollywood connections, often overlooking the nuanced investigative work occurring behind closed doors. Investigators, by contrast, focused on layers, physical evidence, behavioral cues, timelines, and language. One particularly critical element reportedly emerged in the analysis of language. Investigators focused on pronouns, word choices, and phrases that could suggest coordination. A casual use of we versus I in conversation or statement can be incredibly revealing. In this case, reports indicate that investigators flagged such a phrase as potentially significant, linking both Nick and Tracy in ways that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Investigators also reportedly considered motive. While motive alone cannot prove guilt, understanding potential stressors, conflicts, or incentives can help contextualize actions. Were there disputes over property, inheritance, or family authority? Were there personal grievances or emotional triggers that could have influenced behavior? These factors, combined with behavioral and physical evidence, created a more complete picture of the possible dynamics at play. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the deaths of Reiner and Michelle were not just about opportunity. They were about relationships, communication, and behavior. Tracy's involvement added complexity, not merely as an individual, but as part of a potential collaborative dynamic with Nick. Investigators reportedly treated her interactions, movements, and statements with the same rigor as Nick's, seeking patterns and correlations that might illuminate what happened inside the main house. And as investigators dug deeper, the significance of accidental revelations, those casual, unguarded phrases, became even more apparent. They were not dramatic confessions shouted in courtrooms. They were subtle, almost imperceptible admissions, spoken when no one thought they mattered. And yet, they became central to understanding the broader scope of the case. By the end of this phase, the investigation was no longer focused solely on Nick. Tracy Reiner's presence, behavior, and potential coordination with Nick had expanded the scope, requiring investigators to consider a more intricate web of actions, communications, and possible intentions. Every word, every action, and every relationship dynamic was now part of the narrative. And just when it seemed that investigators had begun to map the contours of involvement, the accidental revelation, the phrase, the slip of language that would define much of the case's intrigue, began to take center stage. But what came next would make the implications of that phrase undeniable, shifting the investigation in ways no one outside the inner circle could have anticipated. For words, no warning, no correction, spoken casually, almost imperceptibly, but they refused to disappear once investigators heard them. In the meticulous analysis of homicide investigations, sometimes a single phrase can outweigh months of physical evidence. And in this case, according to reports, that phrase became the fulcrum around which suspicion, strategy, and investigative theory pivoted. The context in which it was said is crucial. It wasn't shouted in anger. It wasn't recorded in a formal interrogation. It slipped out during a conversation, one that seemed routine or emotional at the time. Yet, to investigators trained to detect subtle admissions, these words carried weight. They suggested knowledge, perhaps even complicity, that no outsider could have possessed. Accidental admissions like this are rare, but historically significant. There are countless examples in criminal investigations where suspects inadvertently revealed key information through casual speech. In some cases, the wording is subconscious, almost a psychological leak, betraying what a person knows without consciously intending to admit it. And in this case, those 4 words reportedly implied shared responsibility in a way that investigators could not ignore. To understand the significance, it's essential to revisit the timeline. Sunday, December 14th, was already under intense scrutiny. Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found dead with multiple sharp force injuries. Nick lived in the guest house. Tracy had access. The discovery by Romy, 27, had already shifted the investigative lens inward. But now, investigators had a linguistic clue that suggested a layer of coordination and awareness previously unconfirmed. Behavioral experts reportedly analyzed the phrase in the context of speech patterns, tone, and delivery. Was it said defensively, casually? Did it indicate guilt, or was it merely an emotional reaction? Micro-expressions and pauses were dissected to determine authenticity and intent. The analysis is painstaking because one misinterpretation can derail an entire investigation. At the same time, investigators compared this phrase to previous statements made by both Nick and Tracy. Were there inconsistencies? Did the phrase align with known facts, or did it reveal knowledge they should not have had? According to reports, the phrase did not stand alone. It intersected with gaps in timelines, unexplained movements, and prior behavioral cues. And that intersection made it impossible to ignore. Consider the psychology behind it. People rarely speak in a vacuum. Language reflects thought patterns, awareness, and, sometimes, intent. Investigators reportedly noted that the phrase implied coordination, a subtle linguistic clue that both Nick and Tracy may have been aware of actions or outcomes before they were publicly known. In essence, the words became a bridge connecting individual behavior to collective action. It wasn't just what was said, it was what wasn't said. Silence, omission, and hesitation surrounding the phrase reportedly amplified its significance. Investigators asked themselves, why not correct it? Why not clarify? Why would a person casually use a phrase that implies shared involvement unless, consciously or subconsciously, it reflected reality? Media coverage, naturally, did not capture this nuance. Headlines focus on arrests, charges, and sensational connections. They rarely delve into micro-level behavioral analysis, linguistic subtleties, or the way investigators interpret language over hours of footage and statements. But behind the scenes, every word, every pause, and every hesitation was cataloged, reviewed, and contextualized. The implications extended beyond language. Investigators reportedly mapped the phrase against physical evidence and digital records. Could the knowledge implied by the words be corroborated? Did the phrase align with observed movements? Were there discrepancies between what was said and what was documented? Each question deepened the investigative focus, reinforcing the need to understand the interplay between speech and action. Then there's the question of motive. While a phrase alone cannot prove intent, it can suggest awareness of motive, planning, or coordination. Investigators reportedly considered potential stressors within the family, inheritance disputes, emotional tensions, and previous conflicts. Understanding the broader context helps interpret why someone might accidentally reveal knowledge of an act before it is officially discovered. Importantly, investigators reportedly cross-referenced the phrase with interactions between Nick and Tracy. Were there patterns of communication that suggested coordination? Did both respond similarly to questioning? Did either attempt to redirect attention or clarify their statements? Subtle parallels in language and behavior can be critical when assessing potential collaboration. The psychological weight of accidental admissions cannot be overstated. In interviews, casual remarks often reveal what structured questioning cannot. People under stress may unconsciously betray themselves, speaking more honestly in emotional moments than in rehearsed answers. And in this case, those 4 words reportedly illuminated aspects of the night of December 14th that might have remained hidden otherwise. Investigators reportedly replayed the conversation repeatedly, examining it from multiple angles. Each replay highlighted new nuances, tone shifts, slight hesitations, the rhythm of speech. Analysts dissected every element, correlating it with physical evidence and timelines. The process is exhaustive, methodical, and unforgiving. Small misinterpretations can change the trajectory of a case, but overlooking subtle clues can allow critical details to slip away. The public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the significance of this phrase. Social media commentary, tabloids, and television coverage emphasized arrest and familial shock, but did not capture the forensic weight of language. In high-profile cases, such discrepancies between public perception and investigative reality are common, yet they are critical for understanding how a case unfolds. And so, the phrase became a linchpin, not proof in itself, but a guiding detail. It informed interrogations, shaped strategy, and provided a lens through which investigators interpreted other evidence. Behavioral cues, timeline gaps, and the physical investigation all gained context when analyzed in relation to those 4 words. By the end of this phase, investigators reportedly began to view Nick and Tracy not merely as individuals in proximity, but as potential actors whose awareness, coordination, and communication intersected in ways the public could not yet see. The accidental revelation had shifted the focus from opportunity alone to a more intricate understanding of involvement and awareness. But even with this linguistic breakthrough, the story was far from complete. Investigators still needed to reconcile behavior, timeline, and evidence. And there were more inconsistencies to uncover, small details, contradictions, and unexpected reactions that would continue to build the case and deepen the mystery. And as they moved forward, one thing was clear. The words, once spoken, could not be ignored. They echoed through the investigation, raising questions that would demand answers. And the answers, when they came, would unsettle even the most seasoned observers. But what came next would reveal patterns and behaviors that no one outside the inner circle anticipated, pushing the investigation into uncharted territory. After the accidental revelation, investigators turned with relentless focus to the timeline of December 14th. Understanding exactly who was where, when, and for how long is the backbone of any homicide investigation. In this case, the intricacy was amplified by the estate's layout, the presence of multiple family members, and the subtle movements of Nick and Tracy Reiner. The main house, where Reiner and Michelle were found dead, was separate from the guest house occupied by Nick. On paper, this separation might suggest distance, yet investigators knew proximity is relative. A short walk through hallways or across yards is all it takes to create opportunity, and every second of that day mattered. Investigators reportedly began reconstructing the evening with painstaking precision. Calls made, messages sent, door movements, lighting changes, and household sounds. All were mapped to build a minute-by-minute account. Even small inconsistencies could become vital clues. For instance, a text sent or received at an unexpected time might contradict a stated location, while a door left ajar could indicate movement unseen by others. Alibis were scrutinized intensely. Nick's account of his actions that Sunday was compared against security camera data, phone records, and statements from family members. Investigators looked for overlaps and gaps, periods unaccounted for that could coincide with the estimated time of death. In homicide investigations, unaccounted minutes often carry more weight than explicit confessions because they create a void where actions can hide. Tracy's movements were analyzed similarly. Investigators reportedly reviewed every call, message, and potential witness observation to map her presence relative to both the main house and Nick's guest house. Coordinated behavior, or the appearance of it, was crucial. Could both have acted together without anyone noticing? The timeline was the lens through which these questions were examined. But the challenge wasn't just physical movement. Emotional and behavioral timelines mattered as well. Investigators reportedly analyzed how both suspects interacted in the hours leading up to discovery, assessing tone, tension, and emotional cues. Subtle changes in behavior, hesitation, nervous laughter, abrupt answers, can suggest awareness of information not publicly known. Combined with the accidental revelation, these behavioral cues strengthened investigative focus. Digital evidence added another layer. Phones, texts, emails, and social media activity create a mosaic of presence, communication, and intent. Investigators reportedly compared timestamps against statements, noting discrepancies that required explanation. A text sent moments before the estimated time of death, for example, might contradict a claimed location or alibi. Similarly, gaps in activity, periods when devices went silent, could indicate deliberate absence or attempts to obscure movements. Investigators reportedly paid special attention to small, seemingly insignificant details. A light turned on in the wrong room, a door slightly ajar, a step not accounted for in statements. Individually, these details might be dismissed. Together, they created a pattern that suggested presence and potential coordination. The challenge of constructing a timeline in family homicides is compounded by expectation. Families operate on routine. Investigators rely on predictability. Meal times, sleeping patterns, typical movements. When something deviates from that pattern, it draws attention. Investigators reportedly identified such deviations in the Reiners' household, noting moments where actions didn't align with expected behavior. And then there were the contradictions in statements. Investigators reportedly observed discrepancies between what Nick and Tracy said versus what evidence indicated. Even minor contradictions. Who opened a door first, who went to a certain room, who called or texted when, can signal attempts to mislead or conceal. Behavioral analysts often focus on these contradictions, as they can indicate awareness, intent, or coordination. Investigators also reportedly mapped the sequence of events against physical evidence from the crime scene. Blood patterns, knife placement, and signs of struggle were compared against timelines to identify plausibility. Did the physical evidence align with the stated movements? Were there moments when action must have occurred contrary to statements given? These analyses are painstaking but essential to understanding the full picture. Another critical element was observation of the house itself. Brentwood estates are often equipped with surveillance systems. Investigators reportedly reviewed footage not just for obvious activity, but for subtle cues. Shadows, lights, door movement, and timing of household systems. Even when no clear image is visible, patterns of light or sound can reveal presence. By the end of this timeline reconstruction, investigators reportedly had a detailed map of the night's events, who was likely where, when, and for how long. Gaps remained, of course, but these gaps were as informative as known actions. Every unaccounted minute, every unexplained movement, created opportunities for insight. And as the timeline analysis deepened, the accidental revelation, the four words previously mentioned, gained even more significance. Placed against the reconstructed sequence, the phrase implied awareness that aligned precisely with previously unaccounted periods and movements. Investigators reportedly viewed this intersection as a critical element tying together opportunity, knowledge, and potential coordination. The public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of these subtleties. Headlines focused on arrest and familial betrayal, rarely discussing the meticulous timeline reconstruction and behavioral analysis behind the scenes. Yet for investigators, this was the key to understanding how events unfolded and who had the opportunity to act when the tragedy occurred. But timelines alone cannot prove motive, and motive alone cannot prove coordination. The investigators reportedly next turned to a deeper analysis of relationships, emotional dynamics, and subtle cues of interaction. Patterns of communication, influence, and tension between Nick and Tracy were now under intense scrutiny, with the timeline serving as the backbone against which all behavioral evidence would be measured. And just when investigators thought they had accounted for every movement, every interaction, a new anomaly reportedly emerged. A small, overlooked detail in the timeline that didn't align with any statements or expectations. This anomaly would later become critical in understanding the sequence of events and further implicating actions suggested by the accidental revelation. By the end of this phase, the reconstructed timeline, combined with behavioral cues and linguistic evidence, reportedly gave investigators a far clearer, though still incomplete, understanding of the night. Every gap, contradiction, and unexpected movement added pressure to unravel the mystery, and the next phase of the investigation promised to expose deeper patterns of coordination, communication, and intention. But what came next would reveal connections that no one anticipated, patterns of interaction, subtle behaviors, and overlooked details that would tie together the timeline, the accidental revelation, and the tragic events of December 14th. Understanding a homicide within a family requires more than physical evidence and timelines. It demands insight into relationships, interactions, and subtle behavioral patterns. In the Reiner case, investigators reportedly focused intensely on these elements, recognizing that family dynamics can both reveal motive and explain the unthinkable. Nick Reiner and Tracy Reiner were not just suspects. They were integral participants in a household under scrutiny. Investigators reportedly mapped every interaction leading up to the tragic events. Casual exchanges, tone shifts, micro-expressions, and even body language were analyzed to detect stress, hesitation, or awareness. Every behavioral cue could provide insight into intent or complicity. Family dynamics are complex, particularly in households with wealth, legacy, and fame. Expectations can create tension. Relationships may be fraught with unresolved conflict, jealousy, or emotional strain. Investigators reportedly considered the possibility that long-standing stressors may have influenced the behavior of Nick and Tracy. While such factors do not justify violence, they can contextualize the interactions that preceded it. Behavioral experts reportedly focused on patterns of communication. How did Nick and Tracy talk to each other? Did they signal awareness of events not publicly known? Did their word choice, tone, or phrasing indicate coordination? Accidental revelations often surface in these patterns, phrases spoken casually that suggest knowledge of actions or plans. In this case, the previously noted forward phrase reportedly fit into a broader pattern of linguistic and behavioral cues that concerned investigators. Investigators also reportedly analyzed responses during questioning. Hesitations, over-explanations, and sudden topic changes were all recorded as potential indicators. Behavioral analysis is a critical tool because it can highlight discrepancies between what a suspect says and what evidence shows. In many cases, the way someone responds is as telling as the content of their statement. The dynamics between Nick and Tracy were reportedly scrutinized for signs of influence or collaboration. Were there behavioral cues suggesting one was guiding or directing the other? Did their actions align with shared understanding or pre-planned coordination? Investigators reportedly examined every moment of joint interaction, comparing statements against observed behaviors and timelines. Family hierarchies were also considered. Investigators reportedly examined roles within the household, who held authority, who influenced decisions, and how power dynamics might have shifted over time. In family homicides, understanding authority and influence can help explain how multiple individuals may participate or become complicit in actions. Furthermore, investigators reportedly looked for subtle contradictions in interactions. Discrepancies between claimed emotional states and observed behavior were analyzed. For example, a suspect expressing grief while simultaneously displaying unusual calm can suggest internal conflict or awareness of events beyond public knowledge. Such contrasts often become key investigative points. Behavioral patterns were not examined in isolation. They were mapped against timelines, physical evidence, and the accidental revelation. Investigators reportedly noted that certain behaviors aligned with previously unaccounted periods or with actions implied by the forward phrase. This triangulation strengthened the hypothesis that knowledge of the crime may have been shared between Nick and Tracy. Investigators also reportedly assessed reactions to questioning about other family members, including Romy. Subtle cues, eye movements, facial expressions, and body positioning were recorded to determine whether there was awareness, apprehension, or an attempt to conceal information. These microbehaviors, when viewed collectively, can provide insights into intent and involvement. Social and emotional factors were also considered. Investigators reportedly reviewed interactions over weeks and months leading up to December 14th. Patterns of conflict, tension, or unusual behavior may indicate stressors that, combined with opportunity, create conditions for a tragic event. While these elements alone do not establish guilt, they provide context for interpreting statements, actions, and linguistic clues. Investigators reportedly paid close attention to the way Nick and Tracy responded to new information during questioning. Did they adjust their statements? Did they appear to anticipate questions? Did their language suggest pre-existing knowledge? Subtle signs like these are often crucial in family homicide investigations, where direct evidence may be limited but behavioral cues can reveal intent or complicity. The investigators' approach reflected an understanding that words, actions, and emotions intersect. The accidental revelation, the forward phrase, was now interpreted not as an isolated slip, but as part of a broader behavioral pattern. Cross-referencing this phrase with observed interactions reportedly suggested shared awareness or coordination, reinforcing investigative focus on both Nick and Tracy. By the end of this phase, the behavioral analysis reportedly provided a multidimensional view of the suspects. Physical evidence, timelines, and digital data were now interpreted through the lens of behavioral patterns and family dynamics. Every hesitation, expression, and communication became part of a complex web that investigators believed might explain both the opportunity and the knowledge implied by the accidental revelation. And yet, despite the depth of analysis, questions remained. How did these behaviors translate into action? What decisions led to the events of December 14th? And how did subtle behavioral cues correlate with physical evidence and the timeline? Investigators knew that connecting these elements would be critical for understanding not just what happened, but how and why it occurred.